Hello, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. No agreement in China-US negotiations, but communique remained cordial. The Chinese delegation stated both sides agreed to extend the tariff truce, but no details disclosed. In this century-defining contest between China and the US, the European Union, once seen as a potential third force, has ended up looking like a complete failure. Recently, some comments made by European scholars and experts are worth sharing with you all. With a sense of helplessness, they have thoroughly analyzed what the weak and ineffectual EU has misjudged. First of all, what surprised the EU was that its leaders, who made a special trip to Beijing to meet with Chinese leaders, returned disappointed. Last week, on July 24th, the 25th China-EU leaders' meeting was held in Beijing. After the meeting, both sides jointly issued a China-EU leaders' statement on addressing climate change and agreed to establish an upgraded dialogue mechanism on export controls. On the surface, this China-EU summit seemed relatively uneventful, but that harmony was only superficial. CCTV News quoted insiders as revealing that the EU side found that, on several issues they have long been concerned about, the Chinese side refused to make concessions this time and displayed notable competence and assertiveness during the negotiations. These officials added that ever since forcing the United States to back down on tariff issues 3 months ago, the Chinese side has consistently shown this high level of confidence. Barkin, a senior China-Europe relations analyst at Rhodium Group, also mentioned in his latest report that a senior EU official told him the Chinese side did not yield an inch. The EU originally thought that China would at least make some superficial concessions, but in the end, there were none at all. Another EU official bluntly stated that the Chinese side has changed its strategy. They are convinced they have the United States under control and are confident they can handle the EU as well. Officials returning to Europe from Beijing also said that the Chinese side is clearly unwilling to compromise on industrial policy, and if the EU wants to remain competitive, it must stick to its own position. A report from CCTV News raised a question. After facing trade blows from the United States over the weekend, there is growing doubt from the outside world about how much capability Europe, which is obsessed with internal strife, still has to deal with external challenges. Just 3 days after the conclusion of the China-EU summit, on July 27, the EU and the United States reached a trade agreement, agreeing that goods exported to the US would be subject to a 15% tariff. This sparked huge controversy within Europe, with many criticizing it as an act of surrender. On Monday, White House officials went even further, openly mocking the EU for kowtowing to the United States. Most analysts believe that this agreement reached in Scotland, along with the flattery some European leaders showed Trump during the NATO summit in June. For example, NATO Secretary General Rutte even publicly called Trump Dad, has made Europe appear even weaker and more incompetent in the eyes of countries around the world, including China. Some analysts have pointed out that after tense negotiations in Beijing and heavy trade blows from Washington, EU officials have gained very little. As a result, doubts from the outside world about whether the EU's global influence is declining are growing deeper and deeper. Pu Yaji, a trade expert at the Bruegel Institute, a European think tank in Belgium, commented that the EU-US agreement has exposed the chaos in Europe's foreign policy, and that economics and defense cannot be separated. If you rely on others for security, it's impossible to maintain autonomy in business. He further pointed out that by accepting this extremely unbalanced agreement, the EU has laid bare its subordinate position to the United States. Against the backdrop of intensifying China-US rivalry, this could undermine the EU's hopes of rebuilding its relationship with China. On the 25th, when introducing the situation of the China-EU summit, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that the current summit has reached important consensus on upholding and deepening China-EU relations. At the same time, regarding issues of disagreement such as so-called overcapacity and industrial subsidies, the Chinese side clarified its own position. This summit coincides with the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the EU. Amid a complex and ever-changing international landscape, the direction of China-EU relations has become a focal point of external attention. It is understood that the Brussels side regards a joint statement on climate change as an important achievement. EU sources revealed that officials are expected to hold a meeting in September to assess the progress of the upgraded export control dialogue mechanism. However, overall, the Chinese side maintains a firm and unwavering stance on trade issues. They said that China remains committed to urging the EU to restart the approval process for a long-stalled investment agreement, while also calling for negotiated solutions to trade disputes involving electric vehicles. However, China has made almost no corresponding concessions, including offering any proposals on minimum import prices for electric vehicles that come close to being acceptable. In response to the EU's accusations against China regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Chinese side once again clarified during the summit that the Ukraine issue is not, and should not become, a problem between China and the EU, reiterating its consistent and clear position of promoting peace talks and a political resolution. China also made its stern position clear regarding the EU's sanctions on Chinese companies on the grounds of their alleged involvement with Russia. Spanish-Eurasian relations geopolitical analyst Figueroa wrote an article, pointing out even more sharply that this summit confirmed a long-held suspicion by both China and the US. Europe has already excluded itself from great power competition. On July 30th, Figueroa published an article criticizing that the EU's confusion over its stance toward China and its endless compromises with the United States have both weakened Brussels' influence over China and the US, and have also led to its own marginalization, rendering it an insignificant presence. He pointed out that in 50 years of diplomatic engagement, the differences between Brussels and Beijing have never been as difficult to reconcile as they are now. Of course, part of the reason is the deliberate sowing of discord by the Trump administration in the United States, but the bridge to China is not being dismantled from the outside. Rather, it is Europe itself that is tearing it down, piece by piece, with the root cause lying in the confusion and failure of its own policies. He bluntly stated that if China no longer takes Europe seriously, Brussels has only itself to blame. The article points out that in an international system dominated by realism, the EU still clings to a liberal logic of action. Their adherence to multilateral consensus and the principle of rule of law collapses in the face of naked power politics. Trump took advantage of this mismatch by imposing a false either-or proposition, either rely on American security protection or maintain an economic partnership with China, trapping Brussels and exposing the EU's inability to establish an independent position. On the military front, Brussels agreed without objection to allowing Europe to be tightly bound to the American military-industrial complex. On the economic front, the EU27 has also chosen to surrender, marking Europe's decline from a partner to a vassal. Under such an imposed relationship of dependence, any so-called strategic autonomy for Europe has been completely shattered. When it comes to its stance toward China, Brussels is equally confused. Earlier this year, the EU briefly showed an open attitude toward China, but that has now disappeared. Naturally, this has led China to question the EU's geopolitical credibility and to urge the EU to adjust its political mindset before addressing economic issues. Figueroa interprets this as meaning that China's diplomatic rhetoric actually carries an underlying message, that Europe is not currently suited to participate in serious negotiations. He went on to give an example. On the Ukraine issue, Brussels remains stubborn in its views, insisting that China change its relationship with Russia, yet it fails to put forward any diplomatic initiatives of its own. Figueroa pointed out that Brussels demands China distance itself from Russia, but has never made the same request of other countries that are unwilling to reduce their ties with Moscow. For example, over the past 4 years, India has accounted for 38% of Russia's major arms exports, yet not a single European leader has ever explained why engagement with China must depend on its stance toward Russia, while no such conditions are imposed on other countries. Figueroa said helplessly that Ukraine is not even a member of the EU, yet it has become the sole litmus test for the EU to judge China's position. This logic is completely self-contradictory. Not only does this damage Europe's credibility, it also cuts off any path toward diversification for them. This deliberate targeting of Beijing also completely eliminates any possibility of reshaping the Eurasian landscape. Figueroa believes that the decline of Europe's geopolitical influence also stems from a lack of political leadership. This predicament stems from Europe's double misjudgment, viewing China's strength as a threat, while seeing America's coercion as a normal relationship and a reliable partnership. This has led both China and the US to reach the same conclusion, that European leaders choose compromise rather than autonomy. This is also understandable, as China demonstrates greater resilience and toughness under US pressure. It believes that, aside from maintaining commercial ties, there is no longer any need for deeper engagement with Brussels. Trump's strategy of sowing discord has also succeeded. He has eliminated the outcome Washington fears most, a Europe with authority engaging in deep interaction with a confident China. Figueroa's conclusion is that this China-EU summit proves the stage of the 21st century belongs to two superpowers, not three. After reading Figueroa's analysis, I have a few observations. First, the EU thought it could benefit from both China and the US, but in the end, it ended up empty-handed. Second, the EU thought that by bowing to the US, it could get some compensation from China to make up for its losses. But what it failed to see is that China's strength has already forced even Trump to change his tough stance. This is the result of the EU's lack of self-awareness. Third, the EU's performance actually proves that it has already fallen to second-tier status, becoming a dish on the table rather than someone sitting at the table. Hello everyone,